Marcus Winters stood in the airport terminal, surrounded by stunned flight crew members as cameras flashed. His mother Eloise, still trembling from humiliation, clutched his arm while he delivered the final blow to the airline's regional manager. What began as a simple first-class flight turned into a viral moment of justice when racial profiling met corporate power. Nobody could have predicted that one act of discrimination would lead to an industry revolution. How far would you go to stand up against injustice when it happens to someone you love? Before we dive into this shocking story, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe in standing up for what's right, hit that like and subscribe button to see more stories of everyday people fighting back against discrimination. Marcus Winters was no stranger to beating the odds. At 42, he had transformed himself from a kid in the south side of Chicago to the CEO of Pinnacle Technologies, a Fortune 500 company valued at over $12 billion. His corner office on the 50th floor of the Pinnacle Tower featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, where he once delivered newspapers as a boy. But despite his custom Italian suits and the respect he commanded in boardrooms, Marcus never forgot where he came from or who got him there. Eloise Winters had raised Marcus alone after his father was killed in a factory accident when Marcus was just 7. She worked 3 jobs cleaning offices at night, serving breakfast at a diner in the mornings, and taking shifts at a department store on weekends. Her hands were always rough from cleaning chemicals, but they were gentle when she helped Marcus with his homework. "Education is the one thing they can never take from you," she would tell him as they hunched over textbooks at their kitchen table, the only light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. Despite graduating top of his class, Marcus faced rejection after rejection from tech firms where interviewers seemed impressed with his resume, but somehow always found candidates who were a better cultural fit. He heard the whispers about diversity hires and dealt with assumptions that he must be in sales rather than engineering. At his first job, a colleague had asked him to empty the trash, mistaking him for the janitor despite his degree from MIT. 20 years later, he had proven them all wrong. Marcus had pioneered machine learning algorithms that transformed how companies process data, built his own startup, and eventually merged with Pinnacle, taking over as CEO 5 years ago. Under his leadership, the company's stock had tripled. Now he employed over 15,000 people, including many from underrepresented backgrounds who might have otherwise been overlooked. Just as he almost was. Eloise had never stopped working, refusing Marcus's offers to support her financially. "These hands need to stay busy," she would say. But at 68, arthritis was making her daily tasks more difficult. She had recently retired from the department store after 40 years of service, receiving a small gold-plated pin and a cake in the break room. For her birthday, Marcus wanted to give her something special. He arranged first-class tickets to Paris, a city she had always dreamed of visiting but never thought she would see. He kept it a surprise until the night before, presenting her with a small model of the Eiffel Tower and the tickets. Eloise had cried, holding the tickets like they were made of delicate crystal. "We leave tomorrow morning," Marcus had told her, beaming with pride at finally being able to give his mother the experiences she deserved. "I've booked the presidential suite at the George V. We'll have breakfast with a view of the Eiffel Tower every morning." But then disaster struck. Just 3 hours before their flight, as Eloise was already packed and ready in her Sunday best, Marcus received an urgent call. Their largest client was threatening to pull a $100 million contract due to a security breach. The board was panicking, legal was in chaos, and Marcus was the only one who could salvage the situation. "Mom, I have to go to the office for an emergency meeting. The car will take you to the airport and I'll meet you at the gate before boarding. I promise," he assured her as he kissed her cheek and rushed out, his mind already racing through damage control scenarios. Eloise understood. She had always understood the demands of responsibility. The sleek black company car delivered her to the airport where she stood uncertainly at the first-class check-in counter, clutching her new leather handbag, a Christmas gift from Marcus. She had worn her best outfit, a navy blue dress with matching jacket and a small pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother. Flight attendant Vanessa Whitfield was working the first-class check-in when she noticed Eloise approaching. With 15 years of experience serving the airline's most elite passengers, Vanessa prided herself on identifying real first-class travelers versus those who might have gotten lucky with an upgrade. One glance at Eloise's weathered hands and slightly outdated clothing, and she had already made up her mind. The woman clearly didn't belong in her first-class cabin. "May I help you?" Vanessa asked, her tone suggesting she doubted she could. "I'm checking in for the flight to Paris," Eloise said, sliding her passport and the printed first-class ticket across the counter. Vanessa examined the ticket with exaggerated scrutiny, her perfectly manicured finger tracing over Marcus's name, as the purchaser, then back to Eloise. "And how exactly did you come to have this ticket, ma'am?" The question hung in the air between them, the implication clear as crystal. Eloise straightened her spine as she had done countless times when facing discrimination throughout her life. "My son purchased it for me. It's my birthday gift." Her voice remained steady, despite the familiar sting of being questioned simply, for existing in a space others felt she didn't deserve. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. Without another word to Eloise, she turned and signaled to her supervisor, Bradley Kent, a man whose 20 years with the airline had calcified his views on who belonged where. "Could you come here for a moment? I have a situation." Bradley approached, his gaze immediately assessing Eloise and coming to the same conclusion as Vanessa. "Is there a problem?" he asked, directing the question to Vanessa rather than Eloise, as if the elderly woman weren't standing right there. "This passenger is attempting to check in for first class to Paris. The ticket was purchased by someone else," Vanessa explained, emphasizing the last part meaningfully. Bradley turned to Eloise, his expression stern. "Ma'am, can you explain how you obtained this ticket?" By now, other passengers in the check-in area had begun to notice the interaction. Some had taken out their phones, recording what they sensed might become a viral moment. Eloise felt their eyes on her, heard the murmurs, and fought to maintain her dignity. "As I just explained to your colleague, my son Marcus Winters purchased these tickets as my birthday present. He's the CEO of Pinnacle Technologies." Even as she said it, Eloise hated that she had to invoke her son's position to be treated with basic respect. "I see," Bradley said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her. "We'll need to see additional identification and verification of the purchase. It's unusual for someone to be traveling in first class on a ticket they didn't personally purchase." This was a lie, of course. Spouses, parents, children, and assistants regularly traveled on tickets purchased by others, particularly in first class. But Eloise was being singled out, and everyone knew why. "I have my ID right here," Eloise said, producing her driver's license. "We'll also need to verify the credit card used for purchase," Bradley insisted, a requirement he had never imposed on the white businessman who had checked in minutes earlier with a ticket purchased by his company. As this exchange continued, Connor Phillips, an airport security guard, positioned himself nearby, one hand resting casually on his taser. There had been no indication of any security threat, no raised voices, no aggression from the elderly woman. Yet there he stood, prepared for trouble where none existed except that which was being created by the airline staff themselves. "Is that really necessary?" Eloise asked, nodding toward the security guard. "Just standard procedure, ma'am," Bradley replied, though it was anything but standard. "Why don't you step aside while we sort this out? There are other passengers waiting." Eloise reluctantly moved to the side, feeling the humiliation burning in her cheeks. She reached for her phone to call Marcus, but the call went straight to voicemail. In the executive conference room 50 floors above the city, her son was deep in crisis negotiations, his phone silenced as he fought to save the company's most important contract. For 23 minutes, Eloise stood waiting while travelers streamed past her to their gates. 23 minutes of being treated as suspicious for having the audacity to hold a first-class ticket. 23 minutes of dignity stripped away piece by piece in full public view. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly simply because they didn't look the part? Type 1 in the comments if you've ever been judged based on your appearance rather than your character. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of how they look. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that expose the reality of discrimination that happens every day. What do you think will happen when Eloise finally boards the plane? Will things improve once she's in her first-class seat? Or is this just the beginning of her ordeal? The truth might shock you more than you expect. After nearly half an hour of humiliation, Bradley finally returned with Eloise's documents. "Everything appears to be in order," he announced with obvious reluctance. "You can proceed to your gate. Boarding will begin in 40 minutes. No apology. No acknowledgement of the unnecessary delay or the embarrassment they had caused. Just a grudging admission that she had every right to be exactly where she was all along. Eloise made her way through security, where her bags were randomly selected for additional screening. Another indignity that did not appear to be happening to other passengers of different complexions. By the time she reached Gate 32, boarding had already begun. She quickly joined the first-class line, her boarding pass clutched tightly in her hand. To her dismay, she recognized Vanessa standing at the gate, checking boarding passes. The flight attendant's smile instantly vanished when she saw Eloise. "Boarding pass, please," Vanessa said coldly, extending her hand. Eloise presented her ticket, and Vanessa scanned it without making eye contact. "You're in Group 3. "But this is a first-class ticket," Eloise said, pointing to the clear designation on her boarding pass. Vanessa leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I'm afraid first class has been overbooked. You'll be seated in premium economy. The airline apologizes for the inconvenience." This was another lie. Airlines did not overbook first class, certainly not on international flights where the cabins were carefully managed. Furthermore, if there had been a legitimate overbooking, there would have been announcements, offers of compensation, and requests for volunteers to downgrade. None of that had happened. "That doesn't sound right," Eloise said, her patience wearing thin. "My son specifically purchased first class." "You're holding up the line, ma'am," Vanessa replied, gesturing to the passengers behind her. "You can speak to the gate agent if you have concerns, but right now you need to board or step aside." Feeling the pressure of eyes behind her, Eloise reluctantly proceeded down the jetway. As she stepped onto the plane, she was directed to turn right toward economy instead of left toward first class. The flight attendant there, Trevor Wilson, checked her boarding pass. "Ma'am, this is a first-class ticket. Your seat should be in the forward cabin," he said, seeming genuinely confused. A small hope flickered in Eloise that someone would finally acknowledge the truth. "Vanessa said first class was overbooked and I've been moved to premium economy," Eloise explained. Trevor looked uncertain, but at that moment, Vanessa appeared beside him. "I've got this, Trevor. There was a seating change." She turned to Eloise. "Your seat is 12A. Defeated and not wanting to create a scene, Eloise made her way to premium economy, settling into a seat that was a far cry from the spacious first-class accommodation she was supposed to have. As other passengers boarded, she noticed something that made her blood boil. 2 white passengers were being escorted to first class by Vanessa, who was all smiles and courtesy. "Welcome aboard. We had a couple of openings in first class, so we've upgraded you from the standby list. You're in for a real treat." Eloise couldn't believe what she was witnessing. The first-class cabin that was supposedly overbooked was accepting standby passengers while she, with a paid first-class ticket, had been downgraded without explanation or compensation. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, making her way forward, to speak with Vanessa. "Excuse me," she said as politely as her rising anger would allow. "I just saw you seat standby passengers in first class while I've been downgraded with a paid first-class ticket. I'd like an explanation." Vanessa's smile vanished. "Ma'am, you need to return to your assigned seat immediately. Not until you explain why standby passengers are being seated in first class when you told me it was overbooked. If you continue to be disruptive, I'll have to ask the captain to have you removed from the flight," Vanessa threatened. As if on cue, Captain Richard Hayes emerged from the cockpit. A 30-year veteran of the airline, Hayes had seen his industry change dramatically over the decades, not always in ways he appreciated. He sized up the situation with a glance. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command. "This passenger is refusing to follow crew instructions and is creating a disturbance," Vanessa reported before Eloise could speak. "I have a first-class ticket, but I've been seated in premium economy while standby passengers are being placed in first class," Eloise explained, showing him her boarding pass. Captain Hayes barely glanced at it. "Ma'am, federal regulations require all passengers to comply with crew member instructions. If the flight attendant has assigned you a seat, that's where you need to be. We can sort out any misunderstandings after we're airborne." "But, no buts," he interrupted. "Either return to your assigned seat now, or I'll be forced to have you removed for interfering with crew member duties." The injustice was staggering. Eloise stood there, a 68-year-old woman who had worked hard her entire life, being threatened with removal from a flight for simply asking to receive the service she had paid for. "Am I being clear?" Captain Hayes pressed when she didn't immediately respond. Eloise nodded, tears of frustration and humiliation threatening to spill. She turned and walked back to seat 12A, aware of the stares from other passengers who had witnessed the exchange, but said nothing. As the final boarding procedures were completed, Vanessa's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've had some confusion regarding seating arrangements today. If anyone has an issue with their assigned seat, please feel free to use the call button, and we'll address your concerns once we reach cruising altitude." The false courtesy, the public announcement that seemed aimed directly at shaming Eloise, was the breaking point. She pulled out her phone, ignoring the instructions to put it in airplane mode, and quickly typed a text to her son. "Marcus, they took my first-class seat and gave it to standby passengers. The captain threatened to remove me if I didn't accept it. I've never been so humiliated." As the plane began to taxi, Eloise watched through tear-filled eyes as Vanessa offered champagne to the passengers in first class, including the standby passengers who had taken what should have been her seat. She had faced discrimination her entire life, but somehow this betrayal cut deeper than most. Marcus Winters was just wrapping up the emergency board meeting when his phone vibrated with his mother's text. He had successfully contained the crisis, negotiating a compromise that would keep their biggest client while protecting Pinnacle's interests. The board members were shaking his hand, congratulating him on his quick thinking and leadership when he glanced at his phone screen and felt his world tilt on its axis. "Excuse me," he said abruptly, stepping away from the conference table to read the full message. As the words registered, something powerful and primal rose within him. All his life, he had worked within the system, fought the battles of discrimination with patience, intelligence, and strategic thinking. He had built his success by being twice as good, never losing his cool, always maintaining the professional demeanor expected of a CEO. But this was his mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, the woman who still bore the calluses of decades of manual labor so he could have opportunities, the woman who had taught him his worth in a world determined to diminish it. "I need to go," he announced to the startled board members. "Family emergency." But the press release about the client, his communications director began. "Handle it," Marcus cut him off, already striding toward the door. "Diana, you have authority to sign off on the final language." Diana Chen, Pinnacle's CFO and Marcus's most trusted ally in the company, nodded quickly. She had worked alongside him for 15 years and had never seen that particular look in his eyes. "Go," she said simply. Marcus called his driver as he rode the elevator down. "Get me to the airport now." In the back of the sleek company car, Marcus made a series of rapid-fire calls. First to the airline's corporate headquarters, demanding to speak to someone in authority about his mother's situation. He was shuttled between departments, placed on hold, transferred to customer service, and finally connected with James Thornton, a vice president of customer experience. "Mr. Winters, I understand you're upset, but I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding," Thornton said, his voice dripping with the practiced condescension of someone accustomed to managing the customers. "My mother has a confirmed first-class ticket," Marcus said, fighting to keep his voice level. "She's been downgraded without explanation while standby passengers were seated in first class. The captain threatened to have her removed when she questioned it. Without knowing the specific details, I can't comment on operational decisions made by our flight crew," Thornton replied. "I'd be happy to look into this after the flight and perhaps offer some compensation miles for any inconvenience." "The plane is still on the ground," Marcus said. "You can fix this now." I'm afraid once boarding is complete and the door is closed, we cannot make changes to... Listen carefully, Marcus interrupted, his patience evaporating. I am Marcus Winters, CEO of Pinnacle Technologies. My company books over $30 million in annual travel with your airline. My mother is being discriminated against on your flight right now, and if you don't fix it immediately, I will ensure that every media outlet in the country knows about it by tomorrow morning. Are we clear? There was a pause on the line. Mr. Winters, there's no need for threats. I'm sure we can... The plane hasn't taken off yet. Make it happen. Marcus ended the call and immediately dialed his company's legal counsel. Jeffrey, I need you to prepare for possible legal action against Atlantic Airways for racial discrimination. I'm texting you the details now. His next call was to his head of corporate communications. Sarah, I may need you to prepare a statement about Pinnacle Technologies terminating our relationship with Atlantic Airways due to discriminatory treatment. Stand by for my signal. As his car wove through traffic toward the airport, Marcus received a call from an unknown number. It was Sandra Wells, Atlantic Airways Regional Manager for Airport Operations. Mr. Winters, I just received word about your concerns. I want to assure you we take these matters very seriously. Then do something about it, Marcus replied. The plane is still on the ground. Actually, they've already begun taxiing for takeoff, Sandra informed him. Once an aircraft has left the gate, we... Stop the plane. I'm sorry? You heard me. Stop the plane. Tell the tower there's a security concern, a mechanical issue, whatever you need to say. But that plane does not take off. Mr. Winters, I can't just... You can and you will, Marcus said, his voice deadly calm. Otherwise, I'll be on the phone with the FAA, the NAACP, and every news organization in the country within the next 5 minutes. Your choice. There was a long silence before Sandra replied. I'll see what I can do. 10 minutes later, as Marcus's car pulled up to the departures level at the airport, his phone rang again. It was Sandra Wells. The aircraft is returning to the gate due to a potential maintenance concern, she said, her voice tight. But Mr. Winters, I must emphasize that this is highly irregular and... I'll be at gate 32 in 5 minutes. Have your staff ready to... explain themselves. He ended the call and strode into the terminal, a man on a mission. As he cleared security through the expedited lane, his phone buzzed with a text from his mother. The plane is turning around. What did you do? He didn't respond. Words weren't going to fix this. Action would. Marcus reached gate 32 just as the jetway was being reconnected to the aircraft. Sandra Wells was waiting, flanked by 2 customer service managers, all wearing practiced expressions of corporate concern. Mr. Winters, I'm Sandra Wells, Regional Manager for... I know who you are. Marcus cut her off. I want to board that plane now. Sir, we can't allow non-passengers beyond this point, one of the customer service managers began. Marcus turned to him with a look that could have frozen lava. Try to stop me. Something in his expression must have conveyed the futility of resistance. The gate agent quickly printed a gate pass, and within moments Marcus was striding down the jetway, Sandra Wells hurrying to keep up with his long strides. As he stepped onto the aircraft, the brewing corporate thunderstorm was about to break, with full fury. The discrimination his mother had faced would not go unanswered, and the consequences would echo far beyond this single flight or airline. The storm had been building his entire life, and now, it was finally time to let it rage. The moment Marcus stepped onto the aircraft, every head turned. In his tailored charcoal suit and commanding presence, he was clearly someone of importance, and the tension crackling around him was palpable. The passengers who had been settled in for takeoff were now murmuring in confusion about the delay and unexpected return to the gate. Captain Richard Hayes emerged from the cockpit, his face a mask of professional concern. Sir, this is highly irregular. You cannot be on this aircraft, without proper authorization. Marcus ignored him completely, scanning the cabin until he spotted his mother in seat 12A. The sight of Eloise, sitting small and diminished in the cramped premium economy seat when she should have been enjoying first class, sent a fresh wave of fury through him. He moved directly to her side, kneeling in the aisle. Mom, he said softly, taking her hand. Are you okay? Eloise's eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She had fought too hard and too long in her life to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her. Tears. I'm fine, Marcus, but what are you doing here? The plane was already taxiing. I'm fixing this, he said simply, helping her to her feet. Get your things. Captain Hayes stepped forward, blocking their path. Sir, I need you to exit the aircraft immediately. This passenger has been assigned this seat due to operational requirements, and we need to depart. Marcus turned to face him fully. This passenger is my mother. She has a first-class ticket that your staff downgraded without explanation, compensation, or consent, while seating standby passengers in first class. So unless you want to explain to a federal judge why that doesn't constitute discriminatory treatment, I suggest you get out of our way. By now, flight attendant Vanessa Whitfield had hurried down from first class. Captain, I can explain the seating situation. There were system issues that required some adjustments. System issues, Marcus repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. That's interesting, because the two passengers you upgraded from standby to first class don't seem to be experiencing any system issues. In fact, they're enjoying the champagne that should have been served to my mother. Passengers throughout the cabin had begun recording the confrontation on their phones. In the digital age, incidents like this no longer disappeared into the word-against-word void of customer service complaints. Everything was being documented in real time. If everyone could please remain calm, Sandra Wells said, having followed Marcus onto the plane. Mr. Winters, let's discuss this off the aircraft so these passengers can continue their journey. These passengers can continue their journey as soon as my mother is in her rightful seat in first class, Marcus replied. And I want to hear Vanessa and Captain Hayes explain their actions. Right here. Right now. Vanessa stepped forward, her professional demeanor firmly in place despite the situation. There was a miscommunication about the seating assignments. We can certainly accommodate Ms. Winters in first class now that we're aware of the issue. That's not an explanation. That's an evasion, Marcus countered. You knew exactly what you were doing when you lied about first class being overbooked, and then seated standby passengers there. Captain Hayes attempted to regain control of the situation. Mr. Winters, I was simply following standard protocol when a crew member reports a passenger disruption. A disruption that consisted of my mother politely asking why she was removed from the seat she paid for, Marcus said. Tell me, Captain Hayes, do you threaten to remove all passengers who ask questions or just the black ones? The bluntness of the question sent a ripple through the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, others nodded in recognition of a truth rarely spoken so plainly. That's an outrageous accusation, Hayes blustered. Race had nothing to do with my decisions. Then explain why my mother, with a confirmed first-class ticket, was seated in premium economy while white standby passengers were placed in first class. Explain why she was threatened with removal for questioning this obvious discrepancy. Neither Hayes nor Vanessa had a response that would hold up under scrutiny. Sandra Wells attempted damage control. Mr. Winters, Atlantic Airways has a strict non-discrimination policy. If there was any misunderstanding or if staff failed to follow proper procedures, we sincerely apologize and will conduct a thorough investigation. A misunderstanding implies something accidental, Marcus said. There was nothing accidental about this, and an investigation conveniently places the resolution somewhere in the future, after everyone has moved on. He pulled out his phone and played a recording. It was his earlier conversation with James Thornton, the airline VP who had dismissed his concerns. The recording clearly captured Thornton's condescending tone and lack of urgency regarding a clear case of discriminatory treatment. I record all my business calls as a standard practice, Marcus explained, and this call clearly demonstrates your company's indifference to discrimination. Now, would anyone like to continue pretending this wasn't racial profiling? The cabin had gone completely silent. Sandra Wells looked stricken, realizing the potential legal and public relations disaster unfolding before her. Mr. Winters, she said quietly, perhaps we could offer some compensation to make this right. A full refund of the tickets, additional miles, vouchers for future travel. Marcus looked at her incredulously. You think this is about money? About miles or vouchers? This is about basic human dignity. This is about my mother being humiliated for having the audacity to exist in a space your staff decided she didn't belong in. There is no compensation for that. Sandra lowered her voice further. What would it take to resolve this situation discreetly? Discreetly? Marcus repeated, loud enough for everyone to hear. You want to handle racism discreetly? That's been the problem for generations. Well, not today. Not with my mother. Have you ever witnessed someone trying to brush discrimination under the rug to avoid accountability? Comment 1 if you believe these issues should be addressed, openly rather than swept aside. Hit that like button if you support people standing up against injustice, even when it would be easier to accept the discreet solution. And subscribe if you want to see more stories of people refusing to let prejudice go unchallenged. What do you think Marcus will do next? Will he accept the airline's attempt to quietly resolve the situation, or is he about to demonstrate the true power he wields? The answer might surprise even the most powerful executives in the room. Marcus Winters had built his career on calculated decisions and strategic thinking. Even in moments of crisis, he rarely acted on pure emotion. But as he stood in the aisle of that aircraft, his mother's dignity hanging in the balance, he made a decision that would send shockwaves through an entire industry. He pulled out his phone again and opened Twitter. With practiced efficiency, he typed, "Live from flight number AA207, where my 68-year-old mother was just removed from her paid first-class seat and threatened with removal for questioning why white standby passengers were given her seat. Atlantic Airways, this is what discrimination looks like in 2025. He attached a photo of his mother's first-class ticket alongside a picture of her seated in premium economy, then pressed tweet. Within seconds, his phone began buzzing with notifications as the post spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Marcus had over 2 million followers, many of them industry leaders and influencers, who immediately began amplifying his message. Sandra Wells's phone chimed with an alert, and her face paled as she read it. Mr. Winters, there's no need to escalate this on social media. We can resolve this right here. It's already escalated, Marcus replied calmly. The moment your staff decided my mother didn't deserve the dignity of the service she paid for, it became bigger than just this flight. He turned to address the entire cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay in your journey. My name is Marcus Winters. I'm the CEO of Pinnacle Technologies, and this is my mother, Eloise Winters. Today she was removed from her rightful seat in first class and was seated here while standby passengers took her place. When she questioned this, the captain threatened to have her removed from the flight. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the cabin. Pinnacle Technologies currently spends over $30 million annually on travel with Atlantic Airways for our executives and staff. As of this moment, that relationship is terminated, Sandra Wells gasped audibly. Mr. Winters, please, let's not make hasty decisions. I'm sure we can work something out. This isn't hasty, Marcus replied. This is long overdue. My company will no longer do business with organizations that permit discriminatory treatment of any kind. He turned back to his phone and sent a quick text to Diana Chen. Effective immediately, cancel all corporate bookings with Atlantic Airways. Alert travel department to rebook with competitors. Press release to follow. Diana's response came seconds later. Already on it. Board is being notified. The financial implications were staggering. $30 million in high-margin business. Travel was significant for any airline, but the potential snowball effect as other companies followed Pinnacle's lead could be catastrophic. Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID showed Edward Richmond, CEO of Atlantic Airways. News traveled fast, when millions of dollars were at stake. Edward, Marcus answered, putting the call on speaker. I'm currently on one of your aircraft where my mother was just subjected to discriminatory treatment by your staff. Marcus, I just heard, Richmond replied, his voice tense with forced cordiality. This is clearly a misunderstanding that's gotten out of hand. I've authorized Sandra to provide whatever compensation you feel is appropriate, and I personally guarantee we'll investigate the incident thoroughly. That's generous of you, Edward. But this isn't about compensation. It's about a pattern of Behavior that your airline has apparently normalized. Your staff profiled my mother, lied to her about first class being overbooked, seated standby passengers in her place, and threatened her with removal when she questioned it. Your VP dismissed my concerns when I called, and now your regional manager is asking me to handle it discreetly. Does that sound like a company committed to equal treatment? There was a pause before Richmond responded. Marcus, I understand. You're upset, and you have every right to be, but you're reacting emotionally right now. Terminating a long-standing corporate relationship over one unfortunate incident seems extreme. Perhaps once everyone has had time to cool down. This isn't about cooling down, Marcus interrupted. This is about heating up a conversation that's been lukewarm for too long. My mother worked cleaning office buildings at night so I could get an education. She deserves better than to be treated like a second-class citizen by your company. No one is disputing that, Marcus, but surely there's a more productive way forward than public confrontation and contract termination. I'm open to suggestions, Edward, but they'd better include immediate accountability for everyone involved in this incident. Richmond sighed audibly. What exactly are you looking for here? Marcus didn't hesitate. I want Vanessa, Captain Hayes, Bradley Kent from check-in, and James Thornton from your corporate office placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. I want a comprehensive review of your company's training and policies regarding equal treatment, and I want a public acknowledgement that what happened today was unacceptable. Administrative leave for a captain and senior VP based on one incident? Marcus, be reasonable. I can't just... You can and you will, Marcus cut in. Otherwise, this becomes much more than $30 million in lost business. This becomes a class action lawsuit and a public relations nightmare that will cost you 10 times that amount. The silence on the line stretched as Richmond calculated his options. Finally, he spoke. Sandra can handle the immediate situation. On the ground, you and I should meet tomorrow to discuss the broader issues and response. Today, Edward. This gets addressed today. More silence. Then, fine. My office, 4 o'clock. Your office suggests this is a supplication. It's not. We'll meet at the Pinnacle Technologies conference room at 4, and bring your chief of operations and head of HR. Marcus ended the call before Richmond could respond. The power dynamic had shifted decisively, and everyone on that aircraft knew it. In the space of 15 minutes, a routine case of discrimination that would typically end with an ignored complaint form had escalated to a CEO-level crisis. Sandra Wells looked shell-shocked. Mr. Winters, shall I arrange for your mother to be seated in first class now, so the flight can depart? Marcus looked at his mother, silently asking her preference. Eloise shook her head slightly. I don't think I want to fly with this airline today, Marcus. We'll be deplaning, Marcus informed Sandra, and we'll expect Atlantic Airways to transfer our tickets to another carrier for tomorrow's flight. As Marcus gathered his mother's belongings, his phone buzzed with a news alert. The financial markets had already caught wind of the situation. Atlantic Airways stock had dropped 3% in after-hours trading on rumors of losing Pinnacle Technologies business. By morning, that number would likely multiply as the full story spread. Social media was exploding with the hashtag #JusticeForEloise, which was trending nationally. Thousands of people were sharing their own experiences of discrimination on airlines, creating a tsunami of negative publicity that would take years to overcome. As Marcus and Eloise made their way toward the exit, passengers began to applaud. Not everyone, but enough to make a statement. It was a spontaneous acknowledgement of something rarely seen: actual consequences for the casual discrimination that occurred daily across the country. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement but kept moving. This wasn't about applause or viral moments. This was about something much more fundamental: his mother's dignity and a system that needed dismantling. As they stepped off the aircraft, Sandra Wells attempted one last intervention. Mr. Winters, please reconsider your decision to cancel your corporate contract. Perhaps once you've had time to reflect. Ms. Wells, Marcus said, stopping to face her directly. What happened today isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a culture your company has allowed to flourish. Change that culture, and we can revisit our business relationship. Until then, Pinnacle Technologies will take its business elsewhere. With that, He guided his mother back into the terminal, where news crews had already gathered, alerted by the social media firestorm. The corporate thunderstorm Marcus had unleashed was just beginning, and its effects would reach far beyond one airline or one incident. A reckoning was coming. Edward Richmond was not a man accustomed to being cornered. As CEO of Atlantic Airways for the past decade, he had steered the company through financial crises, labor disputes, and public relations challenges with the unflappable confidence of someone who always held the upper hand. At 59, with silver hair and the polished demeanor of old money, Richmond embodied corporate authority, which is why the current situation was so intolerable to him. "Get me everything we have on you. Marcus Winters," he barked at his executive assistant as he paced his corner office on the 42nd floor of Atlantic Airways headquarters. "And I mean everything. Business dealings, personal life, any skeletons in his closet." The hastily assembled crisis team watched nervously as their CEO abandoned his usual measured approach. The story was spreading with horrifying speed. Justice for Eloise had become the #1 trending topic nationally, with international pickup beginning in Europe and Asia. Video clips from passengers on the flight were being broadcast on major news networks. Atlantic Airways stock had plummeted 12% at the opening bell, wiping out nearly $2 billion in market value in just hours. Richmond's executive helicopter had whisked him from a golf course luncheon back to headquarters as soon as the severity of the crisis became clear. Now, with less than 3 hours before his scheduled meeting at Pinnacle Technologies, he was scrambling for leverage. "Sir, our preliminary background report on Marcus Winters shows a remarkably clean history," his head of corporate intelligence reported. "Harvard Business School, built his first company from scratch, sold it to Pinnacle, and eventually became CEO. Highly respected in the industry, significant philanthropic activities focused on education for underserved communities." "Everyone has dirt," Richmond insisted. "Dig deeper." "There is one incident from about 8 months ago," the intelligence officer continued. "A heated argument with a software vendor who failed to deliver on contract specifications. Apparently, Winters used some colorful language when the vendor tried to charge additional fees for fixes to their own mistakes." Richmond's eyes narrowed. "That's something we can work with. Leak it to the media. Frame it as sources close to the situation question whether Winters has a history of aggressive confrontations when he doesn't get his way. Suggest this might be a pattern of behavior rather than a response to actual discrimination." The communication team exchanged uncomfortable glances but began drafting the narrative. "What about the mother?" Richmond asked. "Anything there we can use?" "Sir, she's a 68-year-old retired department store worker with no criminal record and an impeccable employment history. Widowed when Winters was a child, raised him alone, worked multiple jobs to put him through college. Attempting to discredit her would likely backfire severely." Richmond scowled. "The perfect victim. Fine. Then we pivot to corporate responsibility. I want a press release announcing a $1 million donation to the Urban League and a commitment to enhanced diversity training for all customer-facing staff. Make it clear this is something we had planned before this incident, not a reaction to it. Also," he continued, "reach out to Winters' board members individually. Suggest that while discrimination is obviously unacceptable, Winters' public approach to the situation raises questions about his judgment and temperament as CEO. Imply that his actions were impulsive and potentially damaging to shareholder value." This was more familiar territory for Richmond. Corporate maneuvering, applying pressure at the right points, shifting the narrative. He had built his career on understanding where power truly resided and how to leverage it. If Marcus Winters thought he could simply humiliate Atlantic Airways without consequences, he was about to learn otherwise. "One more thing," Richmond added. "Contact Pinnacle's major competitors. Offer them preferential rates and exclusive perks if they'll publicly announce new corporate travel contracts with us in the next 48 hours. We need to counter the narrative that Winters' actions will spark an exodus of corporate clients." As his team dispersed to execute his directives, Richmond placed a call to William Stewart, chairman of Pinnacle Technologies' board of directors. Stewart was old-school corporate America, a 72-year-old veteran of multiple Fortune 500 boards who valued stability and shareholder returns above all else. "Will, Edward Richmond here. I suspect you're having an interesting day." Stewart's voice was guarded. "Edward, yes, quite unexpected developments. I'll get right to the point, Will. While what happened to Mrs. Winters was regrettable and will be addressed, I'm concerned about Marcus's response. Terminating a major corporate contract via tweet in the heat of the moment raises serious governance questions. Has the board been consulted on this decision that impacts your bottom line and potentially your stock value?" The ensuing pause told Richmond everything he needed to know. The board hadn't been consulted. "These are fair concerns, Edward," Stewart finally replied. "Rest assured, the board is closely monitoring the situation." "I'm scheduled to meet with Marcus at 4 o'clock today," Richmond continued. "I hope cooler heads will prevail, but his demands so far have been, frankly, unreasonable. Placing a captain and senior VP on leave without due process would set a dangerous precedent." "I understand," Stewart said noncommittally. "Perhaps a more measured approach would benefit all parties." Richmond pressed his advantage. "Will, we've known each other for what, 20 years? Served on the National Business Council together? I've always respected Pinnacle Technologies and would hate to see its reputation for sound business judgment compromised by an emotional overreaction, however understandable the initial upset might be." "I appreciate your perspective, Edward. I'll be discussing the matter with the board later today." After ending the call, Richmond smiled slightly. The seeds of doubt had been planted, now to water them. Within hours, his multi-pronged counter-offensive was in full swing. A source familiar with Winters' management style was quoted in a business publication describing him as sometimes volatile when challenged. A financial analyst on a cable news show questioned whether Winters' impulsive decision to terminate a major corporate contract without board approval indicated larger governance issues at Pinnacle Technologies. Richmond's final move was perhaps his most cunning. He placed a call to Andrew Parker, Pinnacle's chief operating officer, and the person who had been passed over for the CEO role when Marcus was selected 5 years earlier. The conversation was brief but pointed, suggesting that a steadier hand might be needed at Pinnacle's helm during this volatile period. By 3:30, when Richmond's executive car pulled up to Pinnacle Technologies headquarters, the narrative was already shifting. What had begun as a straightforward story of discrimination was being reframed as a question of corporate governance, executive temperament, and proper channels for addressing grievances. As Richmond straightened his tie and prepared to enter the lion's den, he felt the familiar confidence returning. Marcus Winters might have won the opening skirmish, but Edward Richmond intended to win the war. After all, he hadn't survived 4 decades in corporate America without learning how to neutralize threats, especially those that challenged the established order. The emergency board meeting of Pinnacle Technologies was called for 7 o'clock that evening, barely 3 hours after Marcus's confrontational meeting with Edward Richmond. The timing was not coincidental. William Stewart had orchestrated it to catch Marcus off balance with minimal preparation time. Marcus learned of the meeting while still in his office, reviewing the outcomes of his face-to-face with Richmond. The airline CEO had presented a carefully crafted response, acknowledgement that processes may not have been optimally followed, never using the word discrimination, offers of sensitivity training for staff, and a proposed joint press release, emphasizing both companies' commitment to learning and growing from this experience. Marcus had rejected these half measures outright, reiterating his demands for specific accountability and structural changes. The meeting had ended in a stalemate, with Richmond warning ominously, "You may find that the support you're counting on isn't as solid as you believe." Now, as his assistant informed him of the emergency board meeting, those words took on new meaning. "Diana," Marcus called to his CFO, who was working late in her adjacent office. "Stewart's called an emergency board meeting for 7. No agenda provided." Diana Chen looked up from her computer, her expression grave. "I just heard from Jeremy, in legal. Apparently Stewart's been making calls to every board member individually over the past 2 hours. About corporate governance concerns regarding unilateral contract termination without board consultation," Diana replied, the bureaucratic language not masking the seriousness of the threat. Marcus understood immediately. Richmond got to him. It appears so, and not just Stewart. I've heard Andrew Parker has been invited to attend the meeting. This was significant. Parker, as COO, occasionally attended board meetings when operations were being discussed, but an emergency meeting about a CEO's actions would not normally include him, unless he was being positioned as an alternative. They're setting up a challenge to my leadership, Marcus said, the realization landing heavily. Diana nodded. Based on the chatter I'm hearing, at least 4 board members are concerned about potential shareholder lawsuits regarding your decision to terminate the Atlantic Airways contract so publicly. Marcus had anticipated some pushback, but not a coordinated effort to potentially remove him as CEO. He had underestimated Richmond's influence and connections. We have 3 hours, he said, his strategic mind already shifting to this new battlefield. Let's prepare. As Marcus and Diana worked feverishly to gather data and build their case, Richmond's counteroffensive continued to gain momentum. A financial news network was running a segment titled Corporate Governance Questions at Pinnacle Technologies, featuring an interview with a leadership expert questioning whether emotional decision-making belongs in the C-suite. Meanwhile, Stewart was methodically laying the groundwork with board members. To Jacob Friedman, the board's senior independent director, he emphasized the potential legal liability. To Rebecca Wong, head of the audit committee, he stressed the financial impact of abruptly terminating a major vendor relationship. To Charles Donnelly, a recent appointee eager to establish himself, he suggested that supporting Marcus might be seen as endorsing impulsive leadership. By 6:30, as board members began arriving at Pinnacle headquarters for the 7 o'clock meeting, the atmosphere was tense. Marcus stood at his office window, watching the city lights emerge as dusk fell, when there was a soft knock at his door. "Come in," he called, expecting Diana with final preparation notes. Instead, it was his mother. Eloise Winters entered quietly, still wearing the same navy blue dress from earlier, though she had removed the pearl necklace. "Mom, what are you doing here? I thought you were resting at the hotel." "Diana called me," Eloise said simply. "She thought I should be here." Marcus shot a questioning look at Diana, who had appeared in the doorway behind Eloise. "The board needs to hear firsthand what happened," Diana explained. "Not Richmond's sanitized version or Stewart's concerns about process. They need to see who this is really about." Marcus hesitated. He had spent his career keeping his family life separate from his corporate responsibilities, protecting his mother from the often cutthroat world he navigated daily. As if reading his thoughts, Eloise stepped forward and placed a weathered hand on his arm. "Marcus, I cleaned executive boardrooms for 20 years. Trust me, nothing in there scares me. And I won't let them use what happened to me as an excuse to take away what you've built." At 7 o'clock sharp, the Pinnacle Technologies boardroom was filled with tension. 12 board members sat around the polished mahogany table with Stewart at the head. Andrew Parker sat in a chair against the wall, his presence a clear signal of the stakes at play. Marcus took his usual seat opposite Stewart, with Diana beside him. Eloise sat quietly in a chair near the door, her presence not yet acknowledged by Stewart or the other board members. "I've called this emergency meeting," Stewart began without preamble, "to address serious concerns about recent actions taken by CEO Marcus Winters without board consultation or approval. Specifically, the public termination of our corporate contract with Atlantic Airways, which represents approximately 7% of our annual travel expenditure and has resulted in significant negative publicity." Stewart gestured to a screen showing a stock ticker. Pinnacle Technologies stock closed down 3.2% today, amid concerns about corporate governance and leadership stability. Several major institutional investors have contacted me directly, expressing their alarm at what they perceive as emotionally driven decision-making. He turned to Marcus. "While the board understands your personal connection to today's unfortunate incident with Atlantic Airways, the manner in which you've handled it raises serious questions about judgment and process. Terminating a major vendor relationship via Twitter, without consultation or proper transition planning, is not how we conduct business at this level." Several board members nodded in agreement. Marcus noticed Andrew Parker leaning forward slightly. unable to completely hide his interest in this potential opening. The board is considering a temporary leadership adjustment while we navigate this situation, Stewart continued. We believe a cooling-off period may be in everyone's best interest, with COO Parker assuming interim responsibilities until this matter is resolved appropriately through proper channels. The room fell silent as the magnitude of what was happening became clear. This wasn't just about a contract termination, or even about Eloise's treatment. This was a coup attempt, expertly orchestrated by Richmond through his connection to Stewart, leveraging the board's inherent conservatism and fear of instability. Have you ever witnessed someone trying to turn the tables on a person who stood up against injustice? Comment 1. If you believe powerful people often close ranks to protect a broken system, hit that like button if you want to see Marcus find a way to fight back against this corporate betrayal. And subscribe to follow more stories about the hidden power dynamics that shape our world. Will Marcus be able to save his position as CEO? Or will standing up for his mother cost him the company he built? And what evidence could possibly turn the tide against such a coordinated attack? The next part reveals a surprising twist that no one saw coming. Marcus rose slowly, his expression calm despite the ambush. Years of facing down boardroom challenges had taught him to never show panic, even when the deck seemed stacked against him. Before we discuss any leadership adjustments, I believe the board deserves to understand exactly what transpired today and why I took the actions I did. His voice was measured but resolute. And for that, I'll need a few minutes of your time. Stewart frowned, clearly unhappy with the deviation from his planned script. We're all familiar with the basic incident, Marcus. Your mother encountered some customer service issues on Atlantic Airways. Customer service issues is a rather sanitized way to describe racial discrimination, William. Marcus gestured toward Eloise. My mother is here and can speak to her experience firsthand if the board wishes to hear it. For the first time, the board members seemed to notice Eloise sitting quietly at the edge of the room. Several shifted uncomfortably in their seats. That won't be necessary, Stewart said quickly. This meeting isn't about the incident itself, but about your response to it. I disagree, Marcus countered. You can't evaluate my response without understanding what I was responding to. He turned to Diana. The materials, please. Diana distributed tablets to each board member. What you're receiving is a comprehensive report compiled over the past 3 hours. The first section contains documentation of today's incident, including passenger videos, internal airline communications obtained through sources, and comparative data on how similarly situated passengers were treated differently. The board members began scrolling through the material, their expressions shifting as they viewed the unfiltered reality of what had occurred. The second section, Diana continued, contains something far more significant, evidence of a pattern. This caught everyone's attention. Working with our legal team and several former Atlantic Airways employees who came forward after today's events, we've documented 78 similar incidents over the past 36 months. In each case, passengers of color with premium tickets were questioned, downgraded, or subjected to additional scrutiny not applied to white passengers. Marcus took over. What happened to my mother today wasn't an isolated incident or a misunderstanding. It was part of a systematic pattern of discriminatory treatment that Atlantic Airways has been aware of and has failed to address. He tapped his own tablet, and a new document appeared on everyone's screens. This is an internal Atlantic Airways memo from 18 months ago, acknowledging an appearance pattern in customer complaints about first-class seating disputes. The memo recommended no action because the complaints came from a statistically small percentage of premium passengers. How did you obtain an internal airline memo? Stewart demanded. Former employees who were troubled by the company's inaction provided it voluntarily, Diana explained. Additionally, we've been contacted by 12 other Atlantic Airways passengers who experienced nearly identical treatment to Mrs. Winters over the past year alone. Marcus continued. The third section of your report contains the legal analysis. Atlantic Airways has settled 11 discrimination claims in private arbitration over the past 5 years, with non-disclosure agreements preventing public knowledge. Our legal team has determined that this establishes a pattern of awareness without corrective action, substantially increasing both liability and potential damages. The boardroom atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. What had begun as a referendum on Marcus's leadership was transforming into something else entirely. "There's more," Diana said. "We've obtained security footage from today's incident that conclusively shows the differential treatment." While Mrs. Winters was being questioned and delayed at check-in, 3 other passengers with identical ticket situations, first-class tickets purchased by someone else, were processed without additional verification. The only visible difference was their race. She played a split-screen video that made the contrast impossible to ignore. The board members watched in silence as the evidence mounted. Marcus moved to the most damning information. "Finally, we've uncovered an unofficial Atlantic Airways document titled Premium Passenger Profile Guidelines that was distributed to first-class cabin staff during training. It contains coded language about identifying passengers who align with the premium brand image and instructions for discreetly managing situations where passengers may have been incorrectly assigned to premium cabins." Rebecca Wong, the auditee committee chair, looked up from her tablet. "This is troubling. Very troubling." Jacob Friedman, the senior independent director, removed his glasses. "If authentic, these documents suggest potential legal exposure far beyond a single incident." "They're authentic," Marcus confirmed. "And they reveal that what happened to my mother was neither accidental nor isolated. It was the product of a corporate culture that Edward Richmond has overseen for a decade." Marcus paused, allowing the weight of the evidence to settle. "So yes, I acted decisively and publicly, because this wasn't just about my mother. It was about a pattern of discrimination that needed to be exposed, not handled discreetly through the usual channels that have failed to create change for years." Stewart appeared shaken but rallied quickly. "This information is concerning, certainly, but it doesn't change the fact that terminating a major contract publicly, without board consultation, violated our governance procedures." "Actually," Diana interjected, "Section 8.3 of the CEO Authorization Matrix grants Marcus unilateral authority to terminate vendor relationships in cases of ethical violations, with post-action notification to the board, which is exactly what this emergency meeting constitutes." Stewart flushed slightly. He had either forgotten this provision or hoped no one would check. Marcus pressed his advantage. "I understand the board's concern about process, but I ask you to consider what message it would send to our employees, our customers, and the public if Pinnacle Technologies chose to prioritize procedural niceties over standing against documented discrimination." The room fell silent as the board members absorbed both the evidence and the moral challenge before them. The narrative had shifted dramatically from where Stewart had tried to steer it. This was no longer about an emotional CEO making impulsive decisions. It was about a leader taking a principled stand against a documented pattern of injustice. Andrew Parker, who had been watching the proceedings with increasing discomfort, quietly rose and slipped out of the room. His opportunity to ascend to the CEO role through this controversy was evaporating before his eyes. As the evidence mounted and the true nature of what Marcus had been responding to became clear, the momentum in the boardroom had unmistakably shifted. What had begun as a potential coup was transforming into something entirely different, a moment of corporate reckoning. As the emergency board meeting approached its 3rd hour, the atmosphere had transformed completely. What Stewart had intended as a swift vote of no confidence in Marcus's leadership had evolved into a comprehensive examination of corporate ethics and responsibility. Marcus stood at the head of the table, having taken control of the meeting from Stewart through the sheer force of evidence and moral clarity. The board members, initially skeptical and concerned about market reactions, now appeared deeply troubled by what they had learned about Atlantic Airways practices. The boardroom door opened, and Jeffrey Rosenberg, Pinnacle's general counsel, entered with a grave expression. "I apologize for the interruption, but there's a development the board should be aware of immediately." Marcus nodded for him to continue. "Edward Richmond is holding a press conference right now. He's announcing Atlantic Airways' commitment to industry-leading diversity initiatives and characterizing today's incident as a learning opportunity. He's also stating that Pinnacle Technologies has agreed to maintain their business relationship following productive discussions. "That's an outright lie," Marcus said. "I made no such agreement." "It gets worse," Jeffrey continued. "He's framing your actions as an understandable emotional reaction that has been appropriately addressed through proper corporate channels." The implications were clear. Richmond was attempting to seize control of the narrative, diminish Marcus's stand against discrimination, and pressure the board into reversing his decision through public expectation. "He's forcing our hand," Diana observed. "If we contradict him now, we look disorganized and indecisive to the market." Marcus was about to respond when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your email." From a friend at Atlantic Airways. He quickly opened his email to find a message containing an audio file with no further explanation. "One moment," he said to the board as he pressed play and held his phone to the speaker system. The room filled with Edward Richmond's voice. "Parker, I understand your frustration. Marcus has had the role you deserved for years. This is your opportunity to step in as the steady hand while we make this discrimination story disappear. Once you're interim CEO, we can restore the travel contract, and in return, Atlantic Airways will ensure Pinnacle gets preferential treatment on all routes. This stays between us, of course." Then came Andrew Parker's voice. "And the board will support this transition? Stewart's on board. He's speaking with the others now. By this time tomorrow, you'll be running Pinnacle Technologies. Just make sure you express appropriate concern about discrimination, while emphasizing the importance of proper channels and corporate process." The recording ended, leaving a stunned silence in the boardroom. All eyes turned to William Stewart, whose face had drained of color. "Care to explain, William?" Jacob Friedman asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Before Stewart could respond, the door opened again. This time, it was Diana's assistant, accompanied by a young black woman in a crisp business suit. "This is Tanya Johnson," Diana announced. Until 3 months ago, she was Edward Richmond's executive assistant at Atlantic Airways. Tanya stepped forward, her posture professional but her eyes betraying nervousness. "Good evening. I left Atlantic Airways after 5 years because I could no longer be part of a culture that systematically discriminated against passengers of color. When I saw today's news, I contacted Ms. Chen with information I believe is relevant." She placed a USB drive on the table. "This contains emails, memos, and meeting recordings documenting Atlantic Airways' awareness of discrimination complaints and their deliberate strategy to manage these issues discreetly rather than address the underlying problems." Jacob Friedman leaned forward. "Ms. Johnson, are you aware of the legal implications of sharing internal corporate documents?" "Yes, sir. I understand I'm violating my NDA. But after seeing what happened to Mrs. Winters today, the same thing I've seen happen to countless others, I decided the truth matters more than my legal protection." Rebecca Wong turned to the general counsel. "Jeffrey, what's our obligation here?" "The documents were obtained without corporate espionage or hacking. They were provided by a whistleblower," Jeffrey replied. "We have no legal obligation to return or destroy them, though Ms. Johnson may face consequences for her disclosure. Pinnacle Technologies will provide full legal representation and protection for Ms. Johnson," Marcus said firmly. "Her courage in coming forward should be rewarded, not punished." The door opened once more, and Andrew Parker re-entered, unaware of what had transpired in his absence. He froze when he saw Tanya Johnson, whom he recognized from meetings with Richmond. "Andrew," Marcus said calmly. "Perfect timing. The board just heard your conversation with Edward Richmond about replacing me as CEO. Would you care to share your perspective on that arrangement?" Parker's face cycled through shock, fear, and calculation before settling on resignation. "It wasn't my idea," he began weakly. "Richmond approached me after the incident went viral. He said the board was already moving against you, and I'd be brought in regardless. I was just trying to position yourself to benefit from my removal." Marcus finished for him, after 5 years of working together. The betrayal stung, but it wasn't surprising. Corporate politics often revealed people's true priorities. Marcus turned back to the board. So here we are. Edward Richmond discriminated against my mother, attempted to cover it up, tried to orchestrate my removal as CEO when I wouldn't play along, and is now lying to the public about our supposed agreement. The question before this board is simple. Do we stand by our company's stated values of integrity and equal treatment? Or do we sacrifice them for political expediency and stock price stability? The board members exchanged glances, the calculus of their decision visibly shifting. Rebecca Wong spoke first. I believe Marcus acted within his authority as CEO and in alignment with our company values. I move that the board formally endorse his decision to terminate our business relationship with Atlantic Airways. Jacob Friedman nodded. Seconded, and I further move that we issue a public statement clarifying that Pinnacle Technologies will not maintain business relationships with companies that engage in or tolerate discriminatory practices. One by one, the board members voiced their support, leaving William Stewart isolated in his opposition. Recognizing defeat, he attempted to save face. Given the additional information presented, I withdraw my concerns about Marcus's leadership decisions. Not good enough, William, Friedman said firmly. Your collusion with Richmond to remove our CEO requires further discussion about your continued role as board chairman. But that's for another meeting. The tide had turned completely. What had begun as an attempt to oust Marcus for standing against discrimination had transformed into a unified board stance, supporting his actions and principles. As the meeting concluded with formal votes endorsing Marcus's decisions, Eloise Winters sat quietly, watching her son with undisguised pride. The system that had been designed to protect itself from accountability had, for once, been forced to bend toward justice instead. Marcus had achieved more than just personal vindication. He had demonstrated that corporate power could be used to demand accountability rather than shield wrongdoing. It was a rare victory in a world where such confrontations usually ended very differently. But as he would soon discover, the battle was far from over. Edward Richmond was not a man to accept defeat gracefully, and the full force of his corporate empire was about to respond with everything it had. The next morning dawned with Atlantic Airways in full crisis mode. Edward Richmond had awakened to disaster on multiple fronts. Pinnacle Technologies had not only reaffirmed their termination of business, but had issued a scathing press release, detailing the airline's pattern of discriminatory practices, backed by whistleblower evidence and internal documents. The stock market response was immediate and brutal. Atlantic Airways shares plummeted 22% in the first hour of trading, triggering circuit breakers that temporarily halted trading. Financial analysts were issuing downgrades, and the airline's largest institutional investors were demanding emergency meetings with Richmond. Even more damaging, 3 other major corporations, including Pinnacle's main tech competitor, had announced reviews of their travel contracts with Atlantic Airways by mid-morning. The corporate dominoes were beginning to fall exactly as Marcus had predicted. At Pinnacle Technologies, Marcus and Diana were convening an unprecedented press conference. The company had transformed its main lobby into a media venue, with representatives from every major news outlet in attendance. But unlike typical corporate damage control events, this one featured something rarely seen: the truth, unvarnished and direct. Eloise Winters sat in the front row, her quiet dignity a powerful rebuke to the system that had tried to diminish her. Beside her sat Tanya Johnson and 11 other former passengers who had experienced similar discrimination on Atlantic Airways flights. Their presence transformed abstract corporate policies into human impact, giving faces to statistics and corporate memos. Marcus approached the podium, the cameras flashing as he prepared to speak. Good morning. Yesterday, my mother, Eloise Winters, was removed from her rightful first-class seat on Atlantic Airways Flight 207 and threatened with removal from the aircraft when she questioned this treatment. When I intervened, I discovered this was not an isolated incident, but part of a documented pattern of discriminatory treatment that Atlantic Airways has been aware of and failed to address for years. He gestured to the row of former passengers. These 12 individuals have bravely come forward with nearly identical experiences. In each case, they held valid premium tickets, but were questioned, downgraded, or removed based on assumptions about whether they belonged in first class. Marcus continued, his voice steady and resolute. Pinnacle Technologies has terminated its business relationship with Atlantic Airways, effective immediately. This isn't merely about one incident or one airline. This is about stating clearly that discrimination cannot be an acceptable cost of doing business. He outlined the evidence that had been uncovered, explaining how the airline's internal documents revealed awareness without action, pattern without correction. As he spoke, slides displayed redacted versions of the most damning evidence, carefully edited to protect ongoing legal proceedings while still making the systemic nature of the problem clear. I'm also announcing today that Pinnacle Technologies is launching the Travel Equity Initiative, with initial funding of $20 million. This program will support research, advocacy, and litigation aimed at ensuring equal treatment for all travelers regardless of race, gender, religion, or appearance. The press conference continued with testimonials from several of the former passengers, each describing experiences so similar to Eloise's that the pattern became impossible to ignore. They spoke of the humiliation, the powerlessness, and the resignation that came from fighting a system designed to wear down resistance through denial and delay. As the event concluded, Marcus invited questions from the press. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal raised the first point. Mr. Winters, Atlantic Airways CEO Edward Richmond has suggested your response was disproportionate and driven by emotion rather than business judgment. How do you respond? Marcus smiled slightly. I'd say Mr. Richmond is half right. Emotion was indeed involved, the appropriate emotional response to witnessing injustice. But my actions were entirely proportionate to an airline that has known about discriminatory treatment for years and chosen to manage the perception rather than fix the problem. Another reporter asked about the market impact on both companies. Pinnacle's stock had actually risen 2% that morning, a vote of investor confidence in Marcus's leadership despite the controversy. The market appears to recognize that principled leadership builds long-term value, Marcus replied. Companies that tolerate discrimination aren't just morally wrong, they're making bad business decisions that eventually affect their bottom line. Across town, Edward Richmond was facing a very different type of meeting. Atlantic Airways' boardroom was filled with grim-faced directors who had watched hundreds of millions in shareholder value evaporate overnight. The airline's legal counsel was outlining the potential liability from class action lawsuits that were already being organized. Based on the evidence now public and the number of potential plaintiffs coming forward, we're looking at possible damages exceeding $300 million, the lawyer explained. And that's before considering the long-term reputational damage and lost business. Richmond, usually imperious and commanding, appeared diminished. His counter-offensive against Marcus had not only failed, but had spectacularly backfired, exposing his own complicity in the airline's discriminatory practices. The Department of Transportation has officially opened an investigation into our compliance with equal treatment regulations, the legal counsel continued. They've requested all documentation related to passenger complaints involving potential discrimination over the past 5 years. A board member spoke up. Edward, we need to understand your direct knowledge of these issues. The memos and emails being cited in the media suggest this wasn't just happening at lower levels. Richmond's attempted defense, that he couldn't possibly track every operational detail in a company with thousands of employees, fell flat, given the documented pattern and his direct involvement in attempting to silence the current controversy. By afternoon, the situation had deteriorated further. Major corporate clients representing over 40% of Atlantic Airways' premium ticket revenue had either suspended their contracts or announced reviews. The airline's credit rating had been placed on negative watch, threatening higher borrowing costs at a time when cash flow was already strained. At 5 o'clock, Atlantic Airways issued a press release announcing that Edward Richmond would be taking a leave of absence while the company conducted a comprehensive review of its practices. Captain Richard Hayes and flight attendant Vanessa Whitfield were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The airline also announced the formation of an independent customer experience advisory board to review and reform its policies. It was the corporate equivalent of unconditional surrender. By evening, the story had expanded beyond one airline or one incident to become a national conversation about the everyday discrimination that remained embedded in American life. Social media was flooded with people sharing their own experiences of being judged, excluded or questioned based on their appearance rather than their credentials or character. Marcus watched these developments from his office, feeling a complex mix of vindication and sobriety. The victory wasn't cause for celebration, but for reflection on how rarely such accountability occurred. For every incident that received this level of exposure and response, thousands went unaddressed, absorbed as the cost of existing while different in America. As night fell, Marcus drove to his mother's home. Eloise had declined the offer to stay at his penthouse apartment, preferring the comfort of her own modest house where she had raised him. When he arrived, she was sitting on her porch swing, watching the fireflies emerge in the early summer evening. "You did good, son," she said simply as he joined her on the swing. "I did what anyone should do," he replied. Eloise smiled knowingly. "But they don't. That's the point." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the gentle creaking of the swing punctuating the evening sounds. "You know," Eloise finally said, "I'm still going to Paris. I've waited 68 years to see the Eiffel Tower. I'm not letting some foolishness stop me now." Marcus laughed, genuinely and freely for the first time since the whole ordeal began. "Yes, ma'am, we'll find another airline." "No," Eloise said, surprising him. "Same airline." "Mom, after everything that happened..." "That's exactly why," she interrupted. "I want to see what changes when people are forced to do better. That's how progress happens. Not by avoiding the places that need to change, but by going back and demanding they do." Marcus considered her words, once again struck by the wisdom that had guided him throughout his life. "Same airline," he agreed. "But this time, I'm not missing that flight for anything." The porch swing continued its gentle rhythm as mother and son sat together, having struck a blow against a system that had never expected to be held accountable. It wasn't the end of discrimination in America, not even close. But it was a reminder that sometimes, just sometimes, justice could prevail when people with power chose to use it for something larger than themselves. 6 months later, Marcus Winters stood at the observation deck of the Eiffel Tower, watching his mother's face as she took in the panoramic view of Paris spread out below them. The journey that had begun with humiliation and confrontation had finally reached its intended destination, though by a path neither of them could have anticipated. The intervening months had brought dramatic changes to both Atlantic Airways and the broader travel industry. Edward Richmond had never returned from his leave of absence, instead announcing his retirement after 37 years in the airline business. The company's board had replaced him with Lydia Patel, a respected industry veteran with a strong record of organizational transformation at competing airlines. Under Patel's leadership, Atlantic Airways had undergone a genuine reimagining of its culture and practices. The airline had settled a class action discrimination lawsuit for $87 million, with the requirement that the settlement include not just financial compensation, but structural reforms. Every employee, from check-in staff to pilots, was now required to complete comprehensive bias training designed by experts in the field, rather than corporate HR departments going through the motions. More significantly, Atlantic Airways had implemented the industry's first fair treatment guarantee, a public commitment that any passenger who experienced discriminatory treatment would receive immediate resolution, full refunds, and additional compensation. The policy included transparent reporting of incidents and resolutions, breaking the cycle of secrecy that had allowed systemic problems to persist for decades. Captain Richard Hayes and flight attendant Vanessa Whitfield had both been terminated, after internal investigation confirmed their pattern of biased treatment extended well beyond the incident with Eloise. As part of their separation agreements, they were required to complete 200 hours of community service working with organizations serving the communities they had discriminated against. The most surprising development had come 3 months after the incident, when Lydia Patel had personally reached out to Marcus with an unprecedented proposal. Atlantic Airways wanted Pinnacle Technologies to develop a comprehensive data analytics system that would track and identify potential bias in customer interactions, essentially building technology to prevent others from experiencing what Eloise had endured. After careful consideration and consultation with his mother, Marcus had agreed, with conditions. The contract would include hiring numerous consultants from underrepresented groups, to ensure the technology addressed real experiences rather than corporate perceptions of the problem. Additionally, 25% of the project fees would be directed to the travel equity initiative that Marcus had established. "It's beautiful," Eloise said, bringing Marcus back to the present moment as they gazed out over the city of light. "Worth waiting for." Marcus squeezed her hand. "I'm sorry it took so long to get here." Eloise shook her head. "Don't be. Sometimes the journey is as important as the destination." She was right, of course. Their delayed trip to Paris had become something more significant than a birthday celebration. It had become a testament to standing firm against injustice, regardless of the cost. The cost had indeed been high for some. William Stewart had resigned as Pinnacle's board chairman after an internal investigation revealed the full extent of his collusion with Richmond. Andrew Parker had left the company entirely, his credibility shattered by the exposed conspiracy to replace Marcus. The corporate world could forgive many things, but being caught in a failed coup was rarely among them. For Marcus, however, the outcome had been unexpectedly positive. Pinnacle Technologies' stock had risen 28% in the 6 months since the incident, as the company's principled stand resonated with both customers and investors looking for corporations willing to align actions with stated values. The firm had attracted record numbers of job applications from top talent, drawn to a company that had proven its commitment to ethical leadership when tested. "We should head back." "Down," Eloise said. "Our dinner reservation is in an hour and I want to change." They took the elevator down to the second level, where tourists bustled about taking photos and buying souvenirs. As they waited for the next elevator to the ground, a young black woman approached them hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Marcus and Eloise Winters?" They nodded, somewhat surprised to be recognized in Paris. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman continued. "I'm a flight attendant with Atlantic Airways. The changes you forced our company to make, they were long overdue. Many of us had been trying to address these issues internally for years without success." She looked at Eloise. "What happened to you was wrong, and I'm so sorry. But the company I work for today is fundamentally different because you stood your ground." Eloise reached out and squeezed the young woman's hand. "Then it was worth it." As they parted ways, Marcus reflected on how a single act of discrimination, the kind that occurred countless times daily across America, had cascaded into industry-wide change when met with the refusal to accept it as normal or inevitable. Later that evening, as they enjoyed dinner at a small bistro near their hotel, Marcus's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Diana Chen, who was managing Pinnacle in his absence. "The Atlantic Airways board just voted unanimously to approve your appointment as the company's newest board member," the message read. "Congratulations. Poetic justice indeed." Marcus smiled as he showed the message to his mother. His decision to purchase a significant ownership stake in Atlantic Airways 3 months earlier had raised eyebrows across the business world. Many had seen it as an inexplicable move. Why invest in a company you had publicly criticized? But Marcus had recognized something that others missed. A company in crisis presented not just risk, but opportunity for meaningful transformation. As a major shareholder and now board member, Marcus would have a direct voice in ensuring that the changes implemented under pressure became permanent features rather than temporary public relations measures. "From removed passenger to board member in 6 months, Eloise mused, shaking her head with amusement. "Not bad." "From a seat in first class to a seat in the boardroom," Marcus agreed. They clinked glasses in a quiet toast, two people who had refused to accept that the way things are is the way they must remain. Their stand had cost a CEO his job, changed an airline's culture, launched an industry-wide reckoning, and demonstrated that power, when wielded with principle, could bend the arc of progress just a little bit further toward justice. Outside, the bistro window, the lights of Paris twinkled in the evening darkness. Eloise Winters had finally made it to the City of Light, arriving not just as a tourist, but as a catalyst for change that would benefit countless travelers who would never know her name. It wasn't the birthday trip they had planned. It was something far more significant. It was proof that standing up against injustice, even at great personal risk, could create ripples that eventually became waves. And sometimes, those waves could change the direction of the tide itself. This story ultimately teaches us that true change requires both moral courage and strategic power. When discrimination occurs, most victims lack the resources to force accountability, allowing injustice to continue unchallenged. Marcus Winters represented something rare, someone with both the personal motivation to fight discrimination and the structural power to make that fight consequential. The lesson isn't simply that we should stand up against injustice, though we should, but that systems of discrimination persist because they're protected by networks of power designed to absorb isolated challenges. Only when these systems face coordinated pressure from multiple directions, legal, financial, public, and internal, do they truly change. We also learn that seemingly minor incidents of discrimination are rarely isolated. They're windows into systemic problems that affect countless others who lack the platform to make their experiences visible. When Marcus exposed Atlantic Airways' pattern of discrimination, he validated thousands of similar experiences that had been dismissed as misunderstandings or isolated incidents. Perhaps most importantly, the story demonstrates that meaningful change requires following through beyond the initial victory. By becoming a board member, Marcus ensured that reforms wouldn't be temporary PR measures, but permanent structural changes. Real transformation doesn't come from momentary outrage, but from sustained engagement with the systems that need changing. The most powerful insight may be Eloise's decision to fly Atlantic Airways again, not to forgive and forget, but to verify that change had actually occurred. True accountability isn't about punishment alone, it's about creating demonstrable improvement in systems that have caused harm. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you had the power to make real change? Or been in Marcus's position, with the ability to use your privilege to fight injustice? Share your experience in the comments below. Would you have handled the situation differently than Marcus did? Type justice if you believe corporations should be held accountable when they enable discrimination. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about everyday heroes standing up against systemic injustice. Remember, change doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it starts with simply refusing to accept the unacceptable, just like Eloise did. Thank you for watching, and may we all find the courage to challenge injustice when we encounter it, whether we have Marcus's corporate power or Eloise's quiet dignity.